The Talisman by the Prowler. I was in the middle of hour 12 of my shift when they wheeled her body in. I should have already been out of this place, but they just kept bringing in body after body. Supposedly the police had just busted up a cult in some old house in the woods, and this was the aftermath I was left to deal with. I've been a coroner here with the Norman, Oklahoma Medical Examiner's Office for 20 years now, and I've never seen so many bodies in one night. There were 10 bodies in total, plus multiple decomposing severed limbs, which I'm presuming belonged to past victims of this cult. Out of the 10 bodies, 7 were cult members, 2 police officers, and the last was a cult's recent victim. Me and my colleague processed all of the cult members and the 2 police officers. When we got to the cult's victim, my colleague's cell phone rang, and after a 2-minute conversation, he sounded frantic. Then hung up the phone and told me his wife was going into labor and asked if he could leave. I told him to get the hell out of here and be with his wife. This was the last body after all. I got the young woman's body on the slab and started looking her over. She looked to be in her early 30s with dark black hair and multiple cuts and carvings all throughout her body. It seemed that the cause of death was the cutting of her throat, but I wouldn't know for sure until a complete examination. As I looked up and down her body, I saw what seemed to be ancient lettering carved into her skin. From head to toe, she was covered. I don't know what it was, but I could only imagine the pain this poor girl went through when they were carving into her. As I reached her head and just about to examine her mouth, the lights went out. I jumped out of my shoes a little bit. The lights had never gone out the entire time I've worked here, so needless to say, I was a little startled, but didn't get too spooked until I noticed the emergency lights hadn't come on. I couldn't see anything at this point, so I stepped away from the autopsy table, pulled out my cell phone, and went to search for the breaker box to turn the lights back on. As I stepped into the corridor that connects the autopsy room to the janitor's closet, I began to hear a metal tapping coming from behind me. At least that's what I thought I heard, but I brushed it off as just me being spooked, or the old pipes in the wall. I made my way to the janitor's closet, found the electrical box, and turned the lights back on. But when I closed the closet door, I heard a woman humming. It was coming from the autopsy room. I stood up against the door, frozen. There shouldn't be anyone here, I thought. I gathered the courage to start heading back to the autopsy room, telling myself I'm just hearing things. As I got to the doorway, I peeked in the room. No one was there. I sighed in relief and approached the autopsy table and went back to work. As I went back to examining her mouth, I could see there was something in there. I took my pliers and pulled out an oddly shaped wooden talisman. It was some kind of cross-like shape I've never seen before, but was obviously up there by the cult members. I turned around to examine it further, and after a couple of minutes, I placed it in the metal tray. But when I turned around, she was gone. The lights began to flicker. A woman's sinister laughter started to echo throughout the room. I couldn't believe what I was witnessing. My body was trembling in complete fear. Macabre chanting could be heard from inside the lockers, where the bodies of the cult members were. The locker doors started opening and slamming in a thunderous fury. Just then, in the corner of the room, out of the shadows, the body of the woman I was examining stood and smiled at me with the most evil of smiles. She reached out her arm towards the talisman. I started to make my way to the door. Right when I was about to run out, she screamed,
"I want your soul."
I turned and ran. I made it to the office and shut the door. Now I'm here trapped. Their loud banging and screaming is all I can hear. If you find this note, please believe what I am telling you. I did not end my own life. I was not murdered by some intruder. Whatever you do, burn the bodies in the morgue. And burn that talisman. There's something wrong with my town's tornado siren system. By Bree Chica, 52. I live in a small town in Oklahoma. I won't name it here, but it's really small. Like 500 people small. Anyway, we are of course located in Tornado Alley, so naturally we have tornado sirens, or storm sirens, depending on who you're talking to. We have a relatively small siren system in comparison to, say, Oklahoma City or more. There's one on a pole next to the fire department. That one's mostly used to alert the firefighters to come to the station for an emergency. There's another one at the local park, and then one downtown and one in my neighborhood. All of the sirens are activated from the fire department, and if something happens to the fire department, the emergency dispatch in the slightly bigger town of Okarche will sound them. My town has a federal signal model too at the fire department, and the rest of the sirens are federal signal 2T22s. They are not electric sirens, so there's no possibility of electronic errors. That's why we found what's been going on so strange. All of this started 2 Saturdays ago during our routine siren test. Our town and most places in Oklahoma test on Saturdays at noon, weather permitting. Anyway, on to what happened. That day, the local radio station made the usual announcement that is as follows. This is a test of the outdoor emergency warning system. This is only a test. Then the sirens began to sound. At first they sounded normal, and then all of a sudden they changed. Instead of a long continuous wail, it became the screaming of a child. Everyone, including my family, walked outside and looked at each other with confused looks on our faces. My neighbor Rick walked across the street and started talking to me and my mom. What the hell was that? I'm not sure, Priscilla. Well, I'm glad it's over. We shook hands with Rick and went back into our house. We flipped on the TV, and the local news was reporting on the siren malfunction. Residents received a shock this morning when instead of the normal sound of the tornado sirens, they heard the screaming of a child. Emergency crews are currently looking into the matter as we speak, and it is believed the system was hacked. The sheriff's office says it was just some teenager hacking the system as a prank, but me and my friends don't believe this because the screams sounded exactly like a little girl who vanished after the last tornado here. My mom thinks that I'm crazy, but Rick seems to believe me. I don't know why they would deny that the siren sounded like her. I've seen him die. by Nowhere Alone. I've seen my son die every night in my dreams, whisked away by some invisible force, something altogether powerful and urgent, grabbing him by the waist and flinging him away and out of sight. The vision is always strange, never fully lucid, shrouded in frantic ink clouds that turned in billowing currents, obscuring everything except my boy. Unkempt blonde hair, youthful cheeks, and bright blue eyes that never seemed to lose their wonder. Night after night they came. They grew to dominate my life, and it became distinctly impossible to get any meaningful rest during those long evening hours, constantly waking in a sweat, fighting for air, trying to wrest that distressing sight from my mind. My son, standing alone, ripped away from me into nothing. Because I loved him, because I worried about him, we experienced a lot together. We traveled and tried new restaurants and met people from all over the world. We did anything that we could to find meaning, to ensure that we would never be apart, just in case that specter dream was to come to pass. One of our favorite annual haunts was the Oklahoma State Fair, where the ride swirled madly. The elephant ears were especially deep-fried, and we could buy cotton candy the size of our forearms for just $2 each. This year was more fun than ever. The rides were bigger, faster, and more inventive. The caramel corn and peanuts were crisp and delightful. The park was full, but the crowd was never too invasive. The air was sharp and fresh. It was the perfect day. The sun was beginning to set against the ridge, bathing the carnival in piercing cherry and burnt orange pastels. As we made our way to the last ride of the night, the Serpent King. I was feeling a bit ill, but my son insisted that we take the ride anyway. He was just tall enough. I stood as he walked away, down a long ramp that led to the entrance, those vibrant red seats with cold metal bars that locked them in place. My son smiled at me as the motor came to life from the pit below, hissing as steam erupted and the joints awoke. He smiled. As the sun died beneath the edge of my vision, the dark clouds began to overtake the park. He smiled as I realized that I had seen this moment before. In my dreams, my son, torn from me, carried away by some horrible thing to his death. I sprinted forward and threw myself over the gate that kept me from him. The machine groaned and shrieked and seemed to laugh even as it sputtered to a start. And I watched, too far away, as my son was lifted into the air by this mechanical beast and spun. Screams, parents, children, everyone. The ride tore at its axis and rocketed sharply to the right, colliding against the dense black asphalt there, splattering everyone aboard. Oklahoma by Sunshine Dreaming. Hicks pushed his way into the dusty saloon. He'd been riding all day, and it was well past dusk. He nodded at the bartender, who poured a whiskey and slid it across the counter. He eyed the whores flitting around the room before landing on one he hadn't seen before. One with gorgeous white skin and dark hair. He stared brazenly at her until she finally met his gaze and sauntered over. She slid up to him at the bar. "Hey, stranger," she said. "What's your name?" He grinned, revealing his yellow teeth. "Hicks." he answered. A lie if she ever heard one. She ignored his teeth and smiled sweetly. New here? He didn't bother asking her name. You could say that. He didn't press her further, because he didn't really care where she came from. She didn't ask him anything either, because it was easier for her if she didn't know much about him. She learned 2 things when she came to Oklahoma. 1, everyone here was running from something. They went west to reinvent themselves. She didn't have to lie about her past, because out here everyone had one. People didn't ask questions. She liked that. Hicks took a sip of his drink and studied her from the corner of his eye. She looked young, far too young to be working here. Not that it mattered to him. He knew what he was here for. You sure look good enough to eat, he pushed. She smiled wider. Oh, I could say the same thing about you, she giggled. They always thought they were something special, as if it was a treat for her to be with them. She knew how she looked, juvenile, innocent, like someone who would do whatever they wanted because she didn't know better. But she was far older and more experienced than any of them could have possibly imagined. She took his hand and led him upstairs. He reeked of sour sweat, and she turned her face so he didn't see how disgusted she was. She hoped it would be quick. And it was. He was no trouble at all. In fact, she had his throat ripped out as soon as he closed the door, before he could even cry for help. She couldn't help but smile at the shock on his face. Afterward, she reclined on the bed, hands folded pensively over her ruined dress. She watched the light drain from his eyes, his face ashen as he sat in a pool of blood. She felt her own heart pumping as the fresh blood filled her stomach. That was the second thing she learned about Oklahoma. It was easy to hunt out here. Why, dinner practically fell in your lap. She certainly wasn't going to starve. In a land of people with no past and no family, no one cared about a dead drifter. She licked the tip of her bloody finger, savoring the rich flavor. She might like it here, after all. Fate Relocation Service by Emergency Leading 8137. There's not much to do in Scoville, Oklahoma. It's a dreary little town with a sign happily proclaiming its meager population of 193. The town lives off of the steady stream of people traveling down I-40. The average person driving by would stop at the only gas station for 30 miles to fill up their tank and maybe head into the one restaurant in town for a slice of Grandma Mary's famous key lime pie. Sometimes people would pull off the highway with a smoking engine or a flat tire and be stuck at the local bed and breakfast while Frank down at the garage performed his slow repairs. Most of these people would sit and bemoan their luck at being stuck in a place like Scoville. They would buy an out-of-vogue magazine to try and ease the boredom, or take solace in the one bar of service their phones barely managed to keep from slipping away. Not Michael Rawson, though. Michael Rawson was a dull man with a dull life, and while most people would dread, or at least be mildly annoyed at, spending more than a few hours in Scoville, he seemed to revel in the boredom. If you were to ask him why he had stopped in this drab little American hamlet, he would respond with a small, even smile and say, "Why, for the business," chuckling slightly to himself as if enjoying some private joke. Michael would walk around the town in his worn-in brown suit, with his briefcase stamped with the letters FRS under his arm, making polite small talk with the residents. Much of the time, these polite chats would end with another of his measured smiles and a wave goodbye. But sometimes, only sometimes, during these chats, he would get a glint in his eyes, a slight, almost imperceptible predatory look that one might compare to a cat about to pounce or a starving wolf spotting a wounded deer. At the end of these conversations, he would open up his briefcase and pull out a letter with a wax seal on the back and bold lettering on the front, proclaiming that it was for customers of the Fate Relocation Service. The people in these situations would put the letter away, thank him for his time, and say they weren't a customer of this Fate Relocation Service. But Michael would just smile and ask them to read the letter later. After a day or two of this, Michael would take his things and leave the town of Scoville. He would wave goodbye to all the citizens he had his polite little chats with, and maybe promise to come back for a slice of key lime pie someday. Oddly, though, the people he delivered the letters to would not wave goodbye to Michael. In fact, if one were to look around the town of Scoville, they wouldn't have seen a single person who had received one of those letters. Michael would make his way out of town with that predatory look in his eyes and that evil smile on his lips. As he drove away from Scoville, past the gas station and the diner, and the cheery sign on the edge of town, proudly proclaiming the meager population of 156, his grin would widen, and he would hum a tune to himself. He would pull back onto I-40 and set his GPS for another small hamlet in the middle of nowhere, Oklahoma. Some might consider Michael a dull, boring man in an old brown suit, but he considered himself one hell of a businessman. The Perfect Storm by Jerden O2. I'm an amateur storm chaser. I don't work for a company, but I like to follow them and film. Storms have always fascinated me, their beautiful, destructive nature. Tornadoes are my favorite. That's why I moved to Oklahoma, right outside of Tornado Alley. I've gotten some really good footage the past few years. At this point, storms don't scare me anymore. I've seen it all, but I never tire of the sights. Only once in my whole life has a tornado genuinely frightened me. It wasn't even a tornado itself, just the man I watched get lost inside. I was following a pretty small tornado, not doing too much harm, but the sunset shone through the storm clouds, making an eerily beautiful sight. I had my camera going, driving slowly down an old dirt road, about half a mile from its touchdown point. Suddenly, I saw an elderly man run out of his home, straight toward the twister. I was horrified, but I couldn't put down the camera. I was too far away to yell or do anything to stop him, so I just watched helplessly and recorded this crazy man running into a tornado. I know he was old. He ran with a limp, and his white hair could be seen for miles, I'm sure. His hunched back gave it away as well. He ran straight into the tornado. I watched him be lifted off the ground, right before the clouds of dust engulfed him. I stopped driving and just watched the tornado slowly dissipate, waiting for a safe path to go and find his body and report to authorities. Once the dust settled down, I saw a figure standing upright, exactly where the tornado had just ascended. There was the old man, except that he was no longer old. It was a tall young man, wearing the same clothing as the elderly man that ran into the storm only moments before. He dusted off his pants, ran his fingers through his hair, and walked back into the house he exited a few minutes before, completely unharmed. I went home that night and deleted the tape. Not sure what I witnessed. I still think about him every day, and the fact that I witnessed some kind of miracle. A Heavy Snow, author unknown. Growing up, my grandfather always had a story to tell me. Some were funny and some were scary, but they always entertained. I like to think it had something to do with his Cherokee heritage. His grandmother was relocated to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears, and he grew up on a farmstead the family came to own. They grew some cotton, but they were barely eking out a living in the isolated wilds of 1940s Oklahoma. My grandpa's name is James, but everyone called him Jim. He was a stern, hard-working man. He spoke slowly with intent, and always with conviction. But he also had a great sense of humor. He would talk about how they lacked luxuries back in the day, but never anything like the walking barefoot uphill to school both ways kind of stuff. He was always realistic and explained the simple things, like getting up early in the morning to start a fire in the wood-burning stove. You had to start the fire early so the family could gather in the warm kitchen while Mama cooked breakfast. One morning it was Jim's turn to get up early and start the fire. My Uncle Pete woke up first and shook him. "Jim, get up and start that fire, it's cold." There was a real heavy snow last night. My grandpa got up and pulled on some clothes over his long johns. Looking out the window, frost crept along the edges of the glass. He made his way through the house in the soft black and blue of early twilight until he got downstairs to the kitchen. The back door led out to a screened porch where they kept the wood pile. My grandpa opened the door to the stove and turned towards the back door to get the wood. He looked up and saw a man standing there, peering inside. The man was only wearing denim overalls, and he looked so cold he was blue. The tip of his nose was black from frostbite, and his stringy, disheveled hair was long enough to cover his eyes. His face was up against the glass of the door, and his chest was heaving, but his breath did not fog up the glass. My grandpa slowly backed away as the doorknob rattled. He turned and ran upstairs and woke up Pete. "Pete, there's a man at the door, and he looks cold." Pete looked at my grandpa skeptically. He got up and went into their parents' room. "Daddy, wake up! Jim saw someone outside." My great-grandpa Eli was a little bit more wary. He got out of his bed, pulled on his boots, and grabbed his shotgun from the closet. Pete grabbed his too, and they went downstairs. Pete went to the front of the house, and Eli went to the back. My grandpa waited by the stairs in between the two. Eli unlocked the back door and walked onto the porch, looked around and behind the woodpile, and walked back inside. "Jim," he said, "I don't think you was lying, but there ain't nothing outside. No man, no animal. The screen's even locked." Just then Pete walked in from the front. He was white as a ghost. "Well," their father asked, "did you see anything?" Pete shook his head. "Didn't see no one, just footprints. Deep footprints going around the front of the house. real deep under the windows. It looked like. My great-grandpa was shaking his head when they heard the back door slam. He turned around and raced to the back with the boys right behind. There was snow in the kitchen and on the back porch. He walked out to the back steps and looked around. There were footprints going around the house, real deep underneath the windows. Eli told the boys to get inside and lock the door. He walked around the house, checked the barn and sheds, and never found anything. My grandpa said he doesn't know who or what he saw that morning. They don't know what came in that kitchen, but he said his father, Eli, was shaken up the most. You see, the snows had ended during the night, but all the prints circling the house were fresh. He never found the footprints leading away. Maxwell, the train engineer. Author unknown. This story was told to me by my mom years after it happened. A few years before I was born, both my parents and sister lived on an Air Force base in Oklahoma. The year was 1985, or somewhere around there. My dad was an Army recruiter at the time, and my mom was a homemaker, staying at home all day with the family dog, Alf. My mom was at home alone for most of the day. My dad worked a 9-to-5 job while my sister went to school. Occasionally, my mom would complain to my dad that she didn't feel right or felt like something was watching her. My dad, being the military man he was, wrote this off as her just being alone for too long. My mom would continue to complain that there was something else in the house, regardless of my dad's reassurance. This went on for quite some time. The feelings then grew into actual events. She began to notice things were getting misplaced. Folded clothes on beds would be thrown on the floor. Keys would go missing, etc. She began to doubt herself. No one else in the house was experiencing these events, and it was frustrating to her. She thought she was losing her mind. The severity of the encounters increased significantly. After about a month of the misplacing of items and the strange feelings, one day while in my sister's room, my mom encountered a black entity. She described it as a dense black cloud. This manifestation entered the room from a wall, hovered over my sister's bed, then vanished back into the wall. My mom instantly removed herself from the room and called my dad. She was worried that this apparition was targeting her daughter. My dad calmed her down over the phone, and the ordeal was no longer spoke of. Soon after, the family dog, Alf, began sensing the presence of the entity. Sometimes, Alf would sit and stare for hours at a time at a particular spot and refuse to enter certain rooms. This strange behavior still did not convince my dad. Most of this ghost talk was obviously sheltered from my sister. They didn't want her to get frightened. That's one of the reasons why my dad chose to not talk about it. Another day while at home, after the black entity incident, my mom was watching TV when she heard Alf bark. She followed the sound and ended up in my sister's room. My sister had a small rocking crib, which she used to play with her toys. As my mom entered the room, she noticed the dog watching the rocking crib rock back and forth. This heightened her fear that whatever was in the house was targeting my sister. She reported her incident to my father, who once again shot it down with skepticism. The final paranormal event happened on a normal day. Keep in mind that these events all happened during the day in fully lit rooms. As my mom was walking from the kitchen to the bathroom, she entered the hallway and froze in sheer terror. There was a man standing at the end of the hallway. a full-body apparition. The man was dressed in old engineer garb, looking like he just got off a train. Oil spills here and there, dirty as can be. He did not speak, and she did not speak, but she knew his name. She told me his name was Maxwell. She didn't know how she knew, but there was something telling her, without words, that his name was Maxwell. She said every single hair on her body rose to the very highest point they could go. After what seemed like hours, Maxwell turned around and disappeared around the corner. She immediately told my dad what had happened during the day. She no longer felt safe in the house. Who knows how many entities were actually occupying the household. Luckily, she got her request. They soon moved out of state to Illinois. But not because of paranormal activity, but because my dad got transferred to a different Air Force base. He continued to deny anything ever happened in that house, but I think he just didn't want to believe it. Years after my mom told me this story, I found out that my dad had paranormal experiences as a child that were severely effed up. This explains why he didn't want to acknowledge any of the weird happenings that were occurring at the house in Oklahoma. I would like to give a heartfelt thank you to the special friends of the channel for your overwhelming generosity. If you would like to support the channel, the link is below in the description. Also, please send me your stories and poems to duchessofdarkness27@gmail.com. You can also find me on Instagram at duchess.ofdarkness and Twitter at duchessofdarkn2. I want to thank all my listeners for your kindness, your encouragement, and your support. It means the world to me. Thank you for joining me. Until next time.